room, who here would like to see humans on Mars? Fantastic. So, if we're going to have humans on Mars, then it's very important that we have life support systems because the environment on Mars is not suitable for human life. And for comparison here, I have a list of the environmental conditions between Earth and on Mars. And you can see that for humans, it's not going to work out so well. But for plants, however, there's plenty of carbon dioxide for the plants to use, and there's water on Mars as well for plants. But unfortunately, the atmospheric pressure on Mars is less than 1% of the Earth's atmospheric pressure, which could cause some problems to grow plants on Mars. So in my research, I was looking at what we could do with the atmosphere on Mars so that we could grow plants to firstly generate oxygen for humans for crewed missions, and also to generate food for those astronauts to eat. So I wanted to design some potential atmospheres, and to do that, I had a few objectives. The first thing that I was doing in my research was to look at all the atmospheric compositions from human spacecrafts throughout history to see how humans have survived in space previously. And then, as I have some background in plant biology through my studies at the Hawkesbury Institute for the Environment in Sydney, Australia, I wanted to look at studies using plants to see the very baseline conditions that plants can actually survive and grow in, to see if this could be helpful in designing atmospheric compositions for a Martian greenhouse. And then, using this data, I came up with some requirements that we should implement for designing atmospheric conditions for Martian greenhouses, and I used these requirements to calculate potential atmospheres for growing plants on Mars. And then, of course, I compared this to other proposed experiments that would like to grow plants in the Martian environment. So firstly, I had a look at the different human spacecraft throughout history and the atmospheric conditions that we used on these spacecraft. In the beginning of human spaceflight, the atmospheric conditions were quite different to what we have here natively on Earth. In fact, in the Apollo, Mercury, and Gemini missions, the atmospheric compositions were quite lower in pressure. So you can see they used a total pressure of 34.5 kilopascals, and the pressure that we have here on Earth is around 100 kilopascals. So these astronauts were subjected to very low atmospheric pressures, but they survived. And in Skylab as well, the pressure used was a quite reduced pressure. But if we come to today, to spacecraft like the International Space Station, it's a very Earth-like atmosphere, which is quite funny when you consider that if we would like to go and live on Mars, and as Claus had mentioned in his previous presentation, why are we trying to make these environments Earth-like? Why don't we try and use the Martian environment and make humans or plants begin to adapt to these kinds of environments? So when I had a look through the literature on some different plant growth experiments, the first environmental factor that I looked at was atmospheric pressure. Atmospheric pressure is very important because it has effects on lots of different parts of the plant, such as in water transport and gas exchange. One of the most notable studies that I saw was a study that used the plant Arabidopsis thaliana, which you might also know as mustard cress or fail cress, and it's actually an edible plant as well. But it's important because it's a model organism, so it's been highly studied. And there's a picture of the plant just there. Now, the study grew this plant at very, very low atmospheric pressure, 10 kilopascals, or about 10% of the pressure that we have here on Earth. And it was able to survive for 24 hours at this very low pressure. Another study in 2007 used lettuce, and they were studying the plants growing at 25 kilopascals, or about a quarter of the atmospheric pressure we have here on Earth. And they were able to grow successfully for 10 days with no issues. They did seem to incorporate a lot more bitter compounds into the leaves of the lettuce, but the total growth was not significantly negatively affected. And so from this, I conclude that atmospheric pressure for plants grown in reduced pressure environments should be 10 kilopascals for a short-term exposure, or for longer-term exposures, 25 kilopascals. What about the percent or proportion of atmospheric oxygen? Well, the plant responses to atmospheric oxygen and atmospheric pressure are actually quite different in as many as 200 genes. But most studies that look at reduced atmospheric pressure don't tend to differentiate between the low pressure and the low oxygen. Luckily, there was a study in 2007 that managed to separate these two different effects. What they did was they grew lettuce at a low pressure and normal Earth ambient pressure, but then within those two pressure treatments, they grew the plants at different levels of oxygen so that you can compare which treatment pressure or oxygen is causing effects to the plants. It's quite cool that they found that under the low pressure treatment, the plant's growth rate was actually fine until the oxygen level dropped below 6 kilopascals. So it seems that you can grow plants in a reduced pressure environment as long as you give them enough oxygen. So I concluded that the minimum partial pressure of oxygen that we should have in an atmospheric design for plant growth is at least 12 kilopascals of oxygen. But what about carbon dioxide? There's a lot of carbon dioxide on Mars. It's about 96% of the atmospheric composition. So a study in 2006 grew plants at two different pressure levels, low and high pressure, and found that as long as you keep the carbon dioxide level above 0.07 kilopascals, plants aren't negatively affected with their photosynthetic rate. And that's because carbon dioxide is what we call the substrate of photosynthesis. It's like if you're trying to bake a cake and you run out of eggs, then you need to keep buying more eggs to make more cakes. In this case, the plants need carbon dioxide so that they can photosynthesize. So you need to give them enough so they have enough to change it into oxygen. But the most critical study that I found that completely revolutionized my thoughts on atmospheric design for Martian greenhouses is a study in 1977 that wasn't even looking at growing plants on Mars. It was a study in energetic biology. And they grew wheat seeds in very, very high levels of carbon dioxide. In fact, this study is the only study, to my knowledge, that has grown seeds of any plant in these high levels of carbon dioxide. 25 kilopascals, which is much higher than the levels that we have on Earth at the moment. At the moment, our level of carbon dioxide is 0.04. So you can see that this is a huge increase in carbon dioxide. And the wheat seeds actually grew. They germinated successfully. So we should grow plants with a minimum partial pressure of at least 0.7 kilopascals and preferably less than 25 kilopascals because anything above this has not yet been tested. And thus I came up with 3 requirements for plant growth in an atmospheric requirements for a Martian greenhouse. The first, that total atmospheric pressure should be at least 25 kilopascals. That the partial pressure of oxygen should be at least 12 kilopascals. And that the partial pressure of carbon dioxide should be at least 0.7 kilopascals and preferably less than 25 kilopascals. And so with this knowledge, I decided to calculate some potential atmospheres for a Martian greenhouse. And due to time, I'm only going to show you my final calculated atmospheric design. But I did initially start off with just pure pressurization of the Martian atmosphere, but I found that that did not have enough oxygen to satisfy these requirements that I've detailed here. So the final atmosphere that I calculated from my design of a Martian greenhouse consists of a total pressure of 34.5 kilopascals, and I selected this value as it is the value that we've seen previously used in spacecraft such as Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo. To make this atmosphere, Martian air should be pressurized to a pressure of 13.1 kilopascals. And then, this atmosphere should be supplemented with pure oxygen at a pressure of 21.4 kilopascals. This should provide enough oxygen, carbon dioxide, and pressure to satisfy all three of those requirements that I listed in the previous slide. And just for interest, if this column here is simply the carbon dioxide partial pressure, which was calculated as carbon dioxide is 96% of Martian air. So, some proposals have been given for sending some plants to Mars, and one that I'm particularly interested in is the Mars Plant Experiment, or MPX, which has been proposed for the Mars 2020 rover, which NASA is currently in the process of selecting payloads for. And Mars Plant Experiment will be about the size of a CubeSat and will be sending over 100 seeds of Arabidopsis thaliana. That's the mustard cress plant that I showed you in a previous slide. This experiment will be testing just Martian gravity and radiation conditions to see if plants can grow on Mars. But the atmosphere that they're using is just simply Earth air that they've enriched with a little bit extra carbon dioxide. But if Mars Plant Experiment is successful, then I believe it should be repeated with the atmosphere that I have designed, which would show that plants can grow on Mars using just the resources available on Mars. That is, Martian air and supplemented with additional pure oxygen. And pure oxygen can be produced on Mars from atmospheric carbon dioxide using a process called the Sabatier reaction. And on Mars 2020 rover, there's actually a payload that will be testing the Sabatier reaction, and it's called MOXIE. So if MOXIE is successful, then it can show that carbon dioxide can be turned to oxygen on Mars, and therefore all elements of my design for an atmosphere in a Martian greenhouse can be made with just the resources available on Mars, and therefore show that humans and plants could exist on Mars using just Martian resources. But my atmosphere is not perfect. Future work could be done to lower the levels of carbon dioxide in my design because it is quite toxic to humans at the moment. And that could be done in two ways, whether that's introducing a third gas into the mix, such as argon, because there is quite about 2% of the Martian atmosphere is argon, or perhaps we could implement some sort of carbon dioxide personalized scrubber system so that when astronauts were to enter the greenhouse, they wouldn't be subjected to the toxic effects of carbon dioxide. That's just some of my references, and I'd like to thank you very much for all of your attention.